So there's been a couple rounds of No Kings protests, and I think that these have been a big success, which I'll get into as part of this episode. But I realize that there's a bit of cognitive dissonance going on currently, where Democrats are saying that Trump is acting like a king, and Republicans are basically laughing that off. Like either they don't believe that that's the case, or they think that the ways that he is acting like a king is basically okay because he's delivering on their agenda, even though he is in fact screwing them over, which I'll also get into as part of this episode. So I thought it was really important to lay out the ways in which Trump is in fact acting like a one-person ruler of this country. And I think it's especially important to lay this out and to make this case as we organize No Kings protests in the future. In other words, how Trump's small dictator energy is affecting Americans' lives. So welcome to Left and Loose. I'm your host, Rich Kim. This is the weekly show where I pour a big glass and I call out Republican bullshit. And before getting to the show, I just wanted to give a usual kind of process update. So this show is on YouTube, podcasts, and Substack. And I'd really appreciate if folks can subscribe to this in each of these places or wherever they can, as it really helps the show grow. Just to note though, our social media has really been blowing up, and especially on Instagram, where there's been getting a lot of traction there and where I post additional content when I'm out for kind of like daily walks and basically losing my mind over politics. So if you're interested in following there as well, the accounts are Left and Loose on both Instagram and on TikTok. Now, getting into this episode and before getting into Trump's small dictator energy, I just want to cover why I think the No Kings protests were such a success. Starting in the beginning of Trump 2.0, I think a lot of Democrats really asked themselves whether or not protesting mattered at the end of the day, because we'd seen in Trump 1.0 these protests like the Women's March, or protests against a Muslim ban, or for George Floyd, and even after all of that, while they were important, Trump still got a second term. So I can completely understand the feelings that people have there. I have that myself. But I think Democrats are increasingly realizing that protesting is just one important piece of the puzzle. And it's part of this broader effort that we're putting in to persuade the American people as we look forward to the elections to come. And in each of these aspects, I continue to believe that we're getting better, and the No Kings protests are a really good example of that. And really, the most important thing about these protests in my mind were that they were well attended and looked to be a fun and actually good time. That there were so many people there in cities and towns across this country, waving flags, holding up signs, including the sign that inspired the title for this episode, and wearing costumes and just being patriotic and having fun as part of this demonstration. And of course, the costumes have been inspired by the frog costumes in Portland, where people are trying to show that when Trump and his cronies lie about the radical left being violent, this is our response, that we're protesting in peaceful and nonviolent and funny ways. And that was also true for the No Kings protests themselves, where there were no major arrests in big cities. But looking back to the bigger picture, again, I feel like the biggest aspect of the No Kings protest is that it looked like the place to be. And our movement looked like the actual patriotic and good-hearted movement to be a part of, as opposed to these images that everyone still has from all these hateful and just buffoonish MAGA rallies. So in other words, I think you could say that we're already countering Trump's small dictator energy with our big democracy energy. Before getting to Trump himself, I just wanted to pause for a minute based on previous episodes. In those episodes, I've really emphasized how important it is that we focus on Republicans other than Trump, as that's who will be facing in upcoming elections. And I still believe that that's really important. But of course, part of winning against those Republicans is to tell the story about how these Republicans have supported all of these horrible and cruel things that Trump has done while in office. So that's why Trump still needs to be part of the picture. We still need to tell a story about Trump and how Republicans have fallen all over themselves to support the agenda of this mad baby king. Now, getting to Trump's small dictator energy, I think that basically comes down to three categories. The first is the creation of fake emergencies in order to exercise almost absolute power. The second is just not obeying laws or having meaningful checks on his power. And the third is, of course, prosecuting his political opponents and attacking free speech in this country. So on fake emergencies, the first place that we see this is probably the tariffs. Now, tariffs are normally something that can only be levied by a president in narrow circumstances and or by coordinating with Congress on levying these. But of course, Trump, who wants to implement this radical right agenda with respect to tariffs, is now inventing emergencies in order to levy these and declare a trade war on the entire world. So he's creating these fake emergencies in a couple respects. The main one is by citing trade deficits. So Trump is saying, hey, when we have trade deficits with other countries, that's so harmful to our economy that we need to levy these tariffs on products coming from that country to make them more expensive in the US so that Americans will end up buying more American products. Now, there's a couple problems with that, of course. The first one is that there's no evidence that running trade deficits with another country is actually harmful. But even if you thought it was, the second is that most of these trade deficits are for goods, and actually the US is running surpluses with respect to services. Just think about all of the services that we sell in other countries, whether it's big tech, banking, whether it's consulting, whether it's any of these millions of other professional services that we put out there. These are big money makers for the US. So yes, in becoming more of a services economy, we have lost manufacturing jobs, but the economy has boomed when we have access to cheap goods and we are selling expensive services to other countries. But of course, that actual context doesn't matter to the administration making up this excuse, and Americans are made to pay these taxes because the Trump administration just says this is a problem while ignoring the factual reality around this. However, even the Trump administration is realizing that this is more or less bullshit, so they're grasping at other excuses. And a main one there is fentanyl. So they've said that, hey, we're levying these tariffs against other countries until they stop the flow of fentanyl to the US. As if these other countries can just wave a magic wand and solve this problem of largely black market commerce of drugs coming to the US. Of course, there's a problem there as well, where countries are not able to do a whole lot about illegal commerce other than what they are currently doing, and potentially then ramped up efforts to actually enforce the laws that are in their country. But again, ultimately, this is just an arbitrary excuse. And the clearest example of that is the tariffs being levied on Canada. One of the reasons there was that Canada should stop the flow of fentanyl to the US. But just in common sense, it's clear that there is very little meaningful flow of fentanyl from Canada versus from our southern border. So it just goes to show just how much of a made up excuse this is, just to justify this exercise of absolute power. And at the end of the day, again, American consumers have to pay for that because the Trump administration is not interested in actually justifying the measures that they're taking. They're interested in just implementing their agenda no matter what the consequences are. Now, hopefully, there will be some scrutiny of these fake emergencies that the Trump administration have invented when the Supreme Court looks at this in the coming months. Ultimately, though, this administration being as radical as it is, I'm sure they will try to circumvent it. So again, this is the small dictator energy at work, just trying to constantly then screw over America while implementing this extremist agenda. The other example of these fake emergencies being used to exercise absolute power is these National Guard deployments. So again, these deployments are only meant to be things that are used in narrow circumstances. So the most recent example prior to the current deployments is probably the George Floyd protests, where during the pandemic and during these protests, there were certain instances of people largely unconnected to the demonstrations using these protests as cover to basically loot stores or to just cause mayhem in general. And so the National Guard was deployed to certain cities where that was the case to try to do basically crowd control. However, what the Trump administration is doing right now is at, of course, a completely other level, where Trump is now making up a fake emergency there in order to justify a National Guard invasion of any blue city that he doesn't like on a given day. So the biggest excuse that they're using there is crime. That they're saying that, crime is at an all-time highs, that these cities are on fire and people can't even go out or go to restaurants, and therefore the National Guard is needed to bring order to these cities. Now, of course, crime is a problem, and during the pandemic, crime went up. But I think that this debate has now basically been resolved, that the way to deal with crime is actually to invest in good and accountable police officers and social services who are dealing with these instances of whether it's crime or mental illness in cities. This is the hard work of local politics. But of course, that's not what Trump is interested in. It's using crime as an excuse to send in the National Guard and basically do MAGA performance art as opposed to actually addressing the underlying issue of crime, because actually addressing that is a long-term project that takes years to do. And you don't have to look very far to see how much this excuse is bullshit, because most of these cities that Trump is sending the National Guard into are actually experiencing decades low levels of crime statistically. Not that they've solved this issue, of course, but that the trend lines are good. And actually, the best way forward would just be to further support them in the efforts that they are already undertaking. So this made-up excuse is having effects on people's lives already. In these big cities, you can imagine that when the National Guard is there, it's not a very comfortable environment for people to actually go out or go to restaurants when you have armed troops in the streets. Or when you're a brown person, for example, and you have ICE in the streets who would rather detain people first and ask questions later, even if these people have valid immigration claims, are legal residents, or even American citizens at the end of the day. But the concern, of course, is what Trump will do in upcoming elections, that he's normalizing the idea of military in the streets, so that when the midterms come around or when the 2028 elections come around, that Trump can use this excuse of crime or protests against the government and against ICE as an excuse to deploy the National Guard in all of these cities, because the purpose of deploying the National Guard in these cities at the time of these elections would be to depress the vote, to make people afraid to come out into the streets during this time, because there are armed soldiers from the government there who are making people feel unsafe. And it goes even further, where there may be a further fake emergency based on the big lie from the 2020 election that this was stolen. That in some instances where the election results are close, that the National Guard needs to take voting machines in order to ensure election integrity, quote unquote. And this is why it's so important that in the upcoming election, we win by clear margins. So that is absolutely clear that this small dictator energy is not going to win, and our big democracy energy will. Okay, so one way in which Trump is acting like a king is with these fake emergencies. Another way is with not obeying laws, which makes sense, right? That's what monarchs do at the end of the day. They say that, hey, the laws don't apply to me if I don't think that they do, if I don't agree with them. And so there's various examples of this, but I'll just start with a small one and get to the increasingly larger ones. The smaller one, quote unquote, is TikTok. So Congress passed a law saying that TikTok needed to be sold or spun off basically by the beginning of this year, or it would be banned. That was a bipartisan law. Trump and Republicans supported it at the time. But of course, when Trump met with a TikTok investor and he had heard that TikTok was a large part of his social media campaign, he suddenly did a 180 on TikTok. And he just decided not to enforce this law that Congress passed. So he granted extension after extension on this ban, which he's no authority to do, and then ultimately decided to sell it to Larry Ellison and a group of investors, basically people that are within his circle. And now, just to be clear, I like that TikTok has not been banned, but what gets me, and which should get every American, whether red or blue, is a president who can just decide at a whim what laws he wants to enforce or not, and no check from Congress or the Supreme Court on that decision to not enforce any given law, and then to sell this platform to his cronies just to give even more billions to the people who are wealthy beyond imagination already in our society. Now, moving on to an even bigger topic is the corruption through the administration. So during Trump 1.0, there was all this concern about the corruption from, for example, foreign officials paying for rooms in Trump hotels or at Trump resorts, and the Trump family being rich that way. What's happening now in Trump 2.0 is like nuclear grade corruption by comparison to like little sparklers during Trump 1.0. So the main part of this is the billions of dollars that are flowing to the Trump family from these crypto and meme coin schemes. And of course, it comes out after the fact that a lot of this is in fact connected to the federal government. So there are billions of dollars coming from the UAE in order for the federal government to agree to export AI chips to this country. Right there, you have the UAE paying to the Trump family in order to get some action, some benefit from the federal government. Then there are hundreds of millions of dollars coming from crypto millionaires in exchange for dismissing cases of fraud against these people or pardoning certain folks. Like the most notable example is CZ, the founder of Binance, who was found guilty of creating a platform that helped to fund terrorist networks, including Hamas and ISIS. And he was serving a prison time. And after investing money in the Trump meme coins, he's now received a pardon. Because that's basically how it works in this small dictator energy era. If you're a wealthy elite and you can pay for special privileges, then you can get that from the federal government. Ultimately, I just can't wait for when Democrats are back in power and we have the power to investigate all of this. Now, getting to the aspect that probably affects Americans' lives the most is the dismantling of the federal government. So the Trump administration has dismantled USAID. They've cut tens of thousands of jobs across the federal government. And these are services, of course, that Americans rely on at the end of the day. And even with USAID, yes, I mean, they were doing foreign work, but these are food. This is food being provided to starving people across the world. This was AIDS medication being provided to people who needed it and relied on that. And already there have been studies about the many casualties that have resulted from the shuttering of this agency, which, by the way, of course, the administration is not in a position to do, right? Because they don't have the legal authority to unilaterally shut down congressionally created agencies or to lay off employees that are supposed to be independent. But again, Trump has not been interested in following any sort of process to meaningfully object to some of this agency work and to work with Congress on if there was any concern around spending or otherwise. It's implementing his radical right agenda regardless of the consequences that are going to be felt, whether it's across the world or here domestically. And Republicans in the process has supported him through all of that. And Lisa say, I mean, when we get back in power, there will be a lot of work to do. And in the midterms, we can hope, at the very least, to stave off the damage from what is remaining at this point. Finally, third are the attacks on his political enemies and attacks on free speech, because that's a thing with kings, right? They don't want any sort of resistance to their power. So we've seen these prosecutions, whether it's of John Bolton, the former national security advisor, James Comey, the former FBI director, Letitia James, the current attorney general of New York, or these additional charges against the federal governor, Lisa Cook. And now, there's not enough time to get through each of these cases, but I think the claims against Lisa Cook are particularly illustrative of just this whole category. And it starts with Trump's director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. This is normally a role that is just very routine in the administration. It's about focusing on people being able to get mortgages. But instead, this guy who's come in, who's a complete MAGA crony, is just solely focused on going after Democrats. So his job here has been to try to catch any sort of political enemies of Trump in whatever technicality they can find in any of these mortgage filings. So with Lisa Cook, the current charge is that she had two residences and she claimed both of them as her primary residence, and she got some benefit of a lower mortgage rate as a result of that. I mean, it sounds just even ridiculous when you can talk about it. But even if you believe that this was an issue, though, you can see that this is a ruse because, of course, there's media reports after the fact that within the Trump administration, there are a lot of people who have done the same thing. But these people, of course, are not being charged and no way are even losing their jobs. So you can see that this is basically an entirely invented pretext just to go after political enemies. And I'm sure that in the vast majority of the cases, this will be proven to be just that. But just even going back to that part of Trump's director of the FHFA going after Lisa Cook, I think that's so illustrative also of the attacks on free speech in this country. Just to think of all the time, energy, and resources that are being spent in this administration to go after political opponents that Trump doesn't like. So that includes, for example, media organizations that air an interview or a joke that the president doesn't like. Or it includes universities that have had protests against what has been going on in Gaza for the past 2 years, which I think a lot of people can agree is a horrible situation. Or law firms who just happen to represent Democrats in proceedings, because yes, Democrats also deserve counsel too, right? The level of time that has and energy that has gone into attacking free speech and free speech activities in this country is like, it's clear that the priority in the administration is not actually serving the American people, it's serving whatever Trump's agenda is. And that's the essence of the small dictator energy here, that it's whatever the king says goes, and the king doesn't tolerate certain speech that he just doesn't like, that just strikes him the wrong way. And I think that's why it's even more important that we criticize this government every chance that we get, and we demonstrate against them every single opportunity that we can. So you guys get what this small dictator energy is all about at the end of the day, right? It's about the Trump administration exercising this absolute power without any meaningful checks, and in order to implement this radical right agenda, ultimately at the expense of Americans. We see that in our everyday lives, whether it comes to the tariffs or these images of these National Guard deployments, or this slow creep of government that just doesn't work for people anymore. It just works for one person in this country, and that is this person who tries to act like a king. And that's why it's all the more important that we have these No Kings protests, and that we continue this broader effort to persuade the American people that what he is doing is completely wrong. And so to that, I would say, cheers to our big democracy energy.